What if the problem isn't the fact that you think, but the fact that you keep thinking the exact same thing again and again and again? Have you ever noticed that? It's not a new thought. It's not a different idea. It's the same content, the same scene, the same conversation, the same concern, repeating, as if it were stuck in a cycle. And that raises an important question. Why does the brain repeat instead of moving forward? If thinking already requires energy, why would repeating consume even more? Here's the thing. There's a detail that completely changes how we understand this. The brain doesn't repeat thoughts by accident. It repeats because it hasn't been able to resolve something yet, or because it believes it hasn't. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of the Zeigarnik Effect? This is a psychological phenomenon that reveals something very interesting. The brain remembers unfinished tasks more than completed ones. What isn't finished remains active, remains accessible, remains open, and when something stays open, it tends to come back. Now imagine this applied to your thoughts. A conversation that didn't have a clear ending, a decision that didn't feel completely right, a situation that remained ambiguous. These experiences don't fully close. They keep running. And every repetition is the brain trying to find a solution. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Did you know that the brain doesn't clearly distinguish between solving something and simply revisiting it? That means that when you repeat a thought, it feels like progress is being made, even when it isn't. This phenomenon can be called the illusion of processing, the feeling that you're solving something, when in reality, you're just repeating it. Now notice how this shows up in everyday life. You remember something you said in a conversation, and you think, I should have said that differently. Minutes later, your mind goes back to the same point, replays the scene, changes the response, recreates the dialogue, but nothing actually changes, and still, you continue. This isn't a lack of control, it's the brain trying to improve the outcome, even if the event has already passed. There's another concept that expands this understanding even further. Have you ever heard of retroactive mental simulation? This is the process by which the brain revisits the past in an attempt to adjust it, as if it were possible to improve something that already happened, as if it were possible to find the perfect response after the fact. This mechanism has an important function: learning, adaptation, refinement. But when it extends for too long, it turns into repetition. And repetition, when it doesn't lead to resolution, becomes a loop. Now think about something simple. You send an important message. The person replies in a short way, ambiguous, without a clear emotional tone. The brain starts interpreting. What does that mean? Is everything okay? Did I do something wrong? These questions don't have immediate answers, and the brain doesn't like that. So it tries to create answers. It tests hypotheses. It simulates possibilities. And without noticing, you begin to revisit the same situation multiple times. This process is directly linked to something called intolerance of ambiguity. The lower the tolerance, the greater the need for clarity. And the greater the need, the more the brain works. The more it repeats, the more it tries to resolve. Now let me ask you something. Have you noticed that these repetitive thoughts tend to show up more when you're alone, or when the environment is quiet? That's not random. When the external world slows down, the internal world gains space, and whatever is unresolved returns. Now there's an even deeper layer. Did you know that the brain interprets repetition as importance? The more a thought appears, the more relevant it seems, even if it isn't. This mechanism is known as salience bias. Repetition increases perceived importance, and this creates an interesting cycle. The thought repeats. It feels important, and because it feels important, it repeats even more. Now, you're starting to see the pattern. It's not just a thought, it's a self-reinforcing system. Another concept that helps clarify this is cognitive reinforcement. Every time you revisit a thought, you strengthen the neural circuit associated with it. That means the thought becomes more accessible, faster, more automatic, and over time, more frequent. It's like a path in a forest. The more you walk through it, the more visible it becomes. The easier it is to follow, the more natural it feels. Now imagine that path as a thought, and you walking through it multiple times a day. See what happens? It becomes the default route, and the brain, for efficiency, tends to follow the easiest path, which means the thought repeats because it became strong, and it became strong because it was repeated. That's how the loop begins. But there's something even deeper happening, and that's exactly what starts turning repetition into something that feels impossible to stop. Now notice something interesting. There comes a point where a thought stops being just repetition and becomes rumination. Have you ever heard of cognitive rumination? Rumination is not simply thinking. Rumination is getting stuck in the same thought while trying to solve something that isn't changing. It's as if the mind is chewing on the same idea, without being able to swallow it, without being able to discard it, without being able to transform it. And here an important question arises. If it's not solving anything, why does the brain keep going? The answer lies in an even deeper mechanism. The brain operates based on predictions. It tries to anticipate what will happen. And when something doesn't match the prediction, it detects an error. This process is called prediction error. Now imagine this in practice. You expect a conversation to end well, but it ends in a strange way. Ambiguous, incomplete. The brain registers. Something didn't go as expected. This error needs to be corrected. And how does it try to do that? By revisiting, reanalyzing, reinterpreting. Each repetition is an attempt to adjust that error. But there's a problem. Not every error can be corrected. Some situations don't have a clear answer. Some experiences don't have a perfect closure. And even so, the brain keeps trying. This activates another important system, the conflict detection system. This system identifies inconsistencies, differences between what happened and what should have happened. And when it detects conflict, it keeps the thought active. Because for the brain, conflict means risk. Now think about this. You remember something you did, and you think, that wasn't exactly how it should have been. That alone is enough. The system activates, and the thought comes back, again, and again, and again. Now here's an even more interesting detail. Did you know that the brain tries to validate thoughts by repeating them? This process can be called an internal validation loop. It works like this. A thought appears. The brain analyzes it, repeats it to check, repeats it again to confirm. And the more it repeats, the more it feels true, even if it's just an interpretation. This mechanism explains why some thoughts feel so convincing, not because they are real, but because they have been repeated many times. Now notice how this shows up in everyday life. You remember a situation, interpret it in a negative way, return to it, reinforce that interpretation, return again, and little by little, it stops being a hypothesis and starts to feel like a fact. That's the power of repetition. But there's something even deeper. Did you know that every time you remember something, you change the memory? This process is called memory reconsolidation. Memory is not fixed, it is dynamic. Each time you revisit a memory, you can modify it, update it, reinterpret it. This can be positive, but it can also reinforce patterns. If you always revisit it with the same bias, the memory adapts to that bias, and that strengthens the loop. Now think of a simple situation. You remember a conversation. Interpret it as negative. Replay the scene. Emphasize the negative points. Repeat this several times. What happens? The memory becomes more negative than it originally was. And that makes the thought come back even stronger. Do you see the cycle? Repetition strengthens interpretation. Interpretation strengthens repetition. Now another essential concept comes in. Have you ever heard of attentional gain? Attentional gain is how much energy the brain directs toward a stimulus. The more attention you give to something, the more important it becomes to the brain. And the more important it seems, the more attention it receives. This creates a closed loop. You focus on the thought. It grows, becomes stronger, returns with more intensity, and captures even more attention. Now notice something interesting. Many people try to stop thinking by fighting the thought. They try to avoid it, suppress it, ignore it. But that can create the opposite effect, because the brain interprets resistance as relevance. If you're trying to avoid it, it must be important. And if it's important, it needs to be monitored. And if it needs to be monitored, it comes back. This is one of the reasons why repetitive thoughts feel uncontrollable, not because they are too strong, but because the system is feeding them without realizing it. Now, a fundamental question arises. If the brain is trying to solve something, why can't it? Because not everything is solved through thinking. Some things require emotional closure. Others require acceptance. Others simply don't have an answer. And the brain is not designed to handle the absence of an answer very well. That's why it keeps going, trying, repeating, reprocessing. Now you're starting to notice something important. The problem is not the thought itself. It's the cycle that forms around it. A cycle that involves attention, interpretation, memory, and the attempt to resolve. And this cycle, when not interrupted, becomes a pattern that feels automatic, a pattern that feels inevitable. But there is still a deeper layer that explains why some thoughts turn into true loops. And that's exactly what we're about to explore next. There comes a point where the thought no longer depends on your attention and starts happening on its own, almost like a reflex, almost like a habit. Have you ever noticed that? Sometimes, before you even realize it, your mind has already returned to the same subject, without effort, without decision, without intention. This happens because the brain learns patterns, and when a pattern is repeated enough, it becomes automated. This process is known as cognitive automatization. The brain turns repeated sequences into automatic responses. This saves energy, increases efficiency, reduces effort, but it also creates a side effect. The thought begins to arise on its own. Now think about this. If you repeat a thought several times a day, for days or weeks, what happens? It stops being an event and becomes a pathway, a fast path, an easy one, always available. This pathway is part of what we can call a mental habit network. Just like physical habits, there are mental habits, patterns of thinking that repeat automatically. And the more you activate that pattern, the stronger it becomes. Now here's something interesting. Did you know the brain doesn't choose the best thought? It chooses the most available one, the most accessible, the most practiced. And if a repetitive thought has been reinforced, it becomes the default choice, even if it's not useful, even if it's not necessary. Now let's go a bit deeper. There is a model called hierarchical prediction. Have you heard of it? This model suggests that the brain organizes information in layers. Deeper layers deal with general patterns. More superficial layers deal with details. When a pattern is reinforced, it moves down into deeper layers, and from there, it begins to influence everything: perception, interpretation, expectation. This means the thought doesn't just appear as a memory, it starts shaping the way you see the world. Now imagine this happening with a repetitive thought. It stops being just a thought and becomes a filter that influences new experiences. This is one of the reasons why some loops feel so real. They're not just repeated, they're integrated. Another concept that helps explain this is increased error sensitivity. Remember prediction error? When it happens frequently, the system can become more sensitive, more alert, more reactive. That means small deviations start to feel like big problems, and that reactivates the cycle. Now think of something simple: a small doubt, an ambiguous response, an uncertain detail. For a sensitive system, that's enough, and the loop begins. Now there's an even more powerful factor. Did you know that emotions increase the strength of a thought? The more emotional charge a thought carries, the more it stands out, the more it returns, the more it sticks. This mechanism can be called an emotional relevance loop. The brain prioritizes what seems important for survival, and emotion is a marker of importance. Now observe this in everyday life. A neutral thought passes quickly, but a thought with emotion stays, returns, repeats, and over time becomes stronger. Now imagine a thought that combines uncertainty, emotion, and repetition. That's the perfect environment for a loop, but there's something even deeper. Did you know that the brain can treat thoughts as threats? Not physical threats, but abstract threats. A worry, a doubt, a negative possibility. This activates a process called abstract threat encoding. The brain registers the thought as something relevant for protection, and anything relevant for protection needs to be monitored. And anything that needs to be monitored comes back. Now notice what's happening. The thought is not just being repeated, it is being protected, preserved, reinforced, as if it were important to keep it active. Another important detail involves learning through internal repetition. Normally, we learn from external experiences, but the brain also learns from what happens internally. If you repeat a thought many times, the brain understands that it is relevant and learns from it, even if it's not real, even if it's not useful. This learning strengthens the loop. Now, let's bring all of this together. The thought repeats, gains strength, becomes automated, turns into a pattern, gains emotional charge, is interpreted as relevant, and begins to arise on its own. This creates a very specific sensation, the feeling that the mind doesn't obey, but in reality, it is following a pattern that has been learned. Now an important question arises. If the brain learns the loop, can it also unlearn it? The answer is yes, but not in the way most people try, because fighting the thought does not break the pattern. In fact, it can strengthen it, and that is exactly what makes this cycle so persistent. Now, there is one final detail that completely changes how we understand these loops, a detail that shows that the problem is not just the thought, but what the brain is trying to do with it. There comes a point where all of this starts to make sense. The thought is not coming back because it is stronger than you. It is coming back because it still hasn't found a point of closure. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that some thoughts simply disappear, while others insist? The difference is not in the content, it's in the level of completion. Thoughts that reach closure, dissolve. Thoughts that remain open, return. It's that simple. But there's an important detail. Closure does not mean having all the answers. Closure means the brain recognizes that it can stop, and that changes everything. Because many people spend hours trying to solve thoughts, when, in reality, what the brain is looking for is not a solution, it's a signal of completion. Now think about this. You can have a problem that is technically resolved, but if the brain did not recognize the ending, it keeps going. And you can have something without an answer, but if there is acceptance, the system slows down. This reveals something fundamental. The loop is not fueled only by doubt. It is fueled by the absence of internal closure. There is a concept that explains this very clearly. Have you ever heard of open loops? These are unfinished cycles, situations that the brain considers incomplete, and while they remain open, they stay active. Now notice the impact of this. It's not the thought that is trapping you, it's the open cycle around it. And the brain does something interesting with open cycles. It keeps them in the foreground, because, for it, that still needs to be resolved. Now, an important question arises. If the brain wants to resolve it, why doesn't it? Because not everything is resolved through analysis. Some things are resolved through integration, others through acceptance, others simply through time. But the brain is not very good at waiting. It prefers to act, even if acting means repeating. Now let's look at this from another angle. The loop is not a failure. It is an attempt to understand, an attempt to predict, an attempt to avoid error, an attempt to ensure safety. But when that attempt doesn't find an exit, it turns into repetition. And repetition, when it doesn't reach closure, becomes a cycle. Now notice something important. The more you try to force the thought to end, the more the brain understands that it is important. And the more important it seems, the more it keeps it active. That's the paradox. Trying to stop it can sustain the loop. Now think about something simple. The more you try not to think about something, the more it appears. This happens because the brain needs to monitor in order to avoid, and by monitoring, it activates it. Now you begin to understand why many loops feel impossible to stop, not because they are too strong, but because they are being fed without awareness. Now there is a crucial point. The brain does not need perfection to stop, it needs coherence. Coherence means the experience makes sense, that there is no active conflict, that there is no pending alert. And when that coherence appears, the system slows down. Now notice a shift in perspective. You don't need to eliminate the thought. You need to allow closure, and closure does not come from repetition, it comes from integration. Now an interesting question arises. What happens when the brain is not stuck in a loop, but also cannot slow down, when it's not just repetition, but a constant flow? A mind that is always active, always busy, always producing thoughts, even without a specific cycle. That is the next level of this understanding. Because in many cases, the problem is not being stuck in a single thought. It's never leaving the state of thinking, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next video. Why the mind feels busy all the time, even when nothing is happening.